Welcome. Yes, we are recording. All right, let's go ahead and do a member roll call. If everybody would just let me know if you're here or not, that would be fantastic. And we're going to start with Dawn. Dawn Alexander, Yolanda.
Stephanie, I just saw Dawn join, just so you know.
Great. So Dawn, we just marked you as here. Yolanda. We'll move on. Kevin.
Here.
Thanks, Kevin. Samantha. Carlos.
Here.
Hi, Carlos. Ashley.
Hello.
Ashley Chase. Jill Cohen, I think I did see you.
Hi.
Good morning. Michelle Dossie.
Hi.
Good morning. Jessica Daughter.
Present.
Hi.
Good morning.
Tara.
Good morning, present.
Thank you. Ida is gone today. We can mark her absent. Jennifer.
Hi, good morning, everybody.
Hi, Jen. Good to see you, my friend.
You too.
Leanna.
I'm here. Good morning.
Hi, Zane.
Good morning.
Nate Halpern.
I'm here too. Good morning, everyone.
Hi, Nate. Adriana. Lori Jenkins, I think we have as absent. Am I correct on that, Trace?
Yes, correct.
Great. We'll move on to Shayna.
I'm here. Good morning.
Good morning, Shayna. Tess. Gina.
Good morning. I'm here.
Hi, Gina. Kristen. No Kristen yet. Michelle Murphy. Okay, Margaret.
Good morning. How are you, Stephanie?
Hi, Margaret. Nice to see you. Colleen.
Good morning. I'm here.
Fantastic. Sarah.
Here.
Excellent. Hi, Sarah. Roshan.
I'm here. Good morning. Hi,
There you are. Hello. Now, Brynja, I don't think is going to be with us today. Brynja has taken a new position, and so she's going to be leaving our task force, and we'll be getting a replacement for her. Trace, I don't think she planned on being here today, but just with that background.
Yeah, I agree.
Nikki. Kathy Wells.
Sorry, this is Nikki. I'm here. I was having trouble unmuting.
Great to see you, Nikki. Kathy.
Good morning, everyone.
Hello, Vice Chair. Good morning. Donna Wilson.
Good morning.
Hi, Donna. And do we have, I was going to say Kelsey Wirtz, but Heather was filling in for her. I'm not sure if we have Heather or Kelsey today. And right now it looks like I have neither. So we'll keep moving on. Jade. Okay, and then me, we're here, all accounted for. Thank you. Moving on, I just want to move to the meeting minutes from the July 19th meeting. And has everybody had an opportunity to review those? Just a show of hands. Fantastic. Are there any additions, corrections that people would like to recommend?
There were a few just typos, but nothing substantive.
Okay, Margaret, why don't we get you and Trace together offline, and we can go ahead and incorporate those typos that you've referred to. Fantastic.
Yeah. Margaret,
any substantive changes by any members of the task force as to the meeting minutes? Okay, and I do just want to take a pause. Ashley just checked in, and so did Yolanda. Great. Having heard that we need no corrections to those meeting minutes, can I have a motion and a second?
I second that.
So Shayna is the second. Who's my first? Who's my initial mover?
I'll motion to.
Thank you, Tara. So all in favor, let me do the opposite. Who is not in favor of passing these meeting minutes from July 19, 2023? All right, and let the record reflect. Nobody is objecting to the passage of those minutes. And Kathy Wells, thank you. We've got you down as an abstention just because of your absence. So fantastic. Moving to now the meeting recap from that same meeting, July 19 of 2023. Again, are there any additions, corrections that task force members would like to make to that document? And again, just as a reminder, we are approving that document because it will be going into the substance of our report. And that's why it's particularly important that folks read that and feel comfortable with it. So any additions or changes to the meeting recap? All right, seeing none, if I could have a motion and a second, and if you'll announce who you are when you make it.
I move to adopt the meeting recap.
Thanks, Margaret. And do we have a second?
Michelle Dawsey, I'll second.
Thank you, Michelle. Anybody who is opposed to approval of that meeting recap summary from July 19, 2023? Okay, we'll go ahead and that recap will pass. Thank you very much. And my job's done here, man. I'm leaving. See ya.
You're out. You're checked out.
I'm
Perfect.
out. That was the hard part.
Great job, Stephanie. You did it.
Thank you.
Thanks. Good morning, y'all. Excited to jump in today. We've got a packed agenda once again, a couple of panels. We're going to talk to our folks at the Casey Family Programs, and we actually have a little bit more time given the size of our panels today for those conversations. So excited to spend a little bit more time in conversation today rather than having to jump off early into the presentation piece. If you could, Jordan, go ahead and pull up the slides. Wow, on cue. I love it. So just want to remind folks kind of where we're at. Again, I know it feels like, wow, we're still in these same three, directives around analyzing the effectiveness, but that is the meat of this work, right? And we want to make sure that we're giving voice to all members of the task force from their perspectives of challenges, nuances, additions, changes, et cetera, that they want the rest of the task force to be aware as we continue to build this report and building these sort of subsequent recommendations. I think one thing I want to note is that we know that a number of you all, I think a small number, but a few of you have not been able to participate on the panels and won't be because your panel passed and let's say that your schedule didn't align or whatnot. So I just want to note that we're going to find, we're going to have an alternative way for you to ensure that your voice is still captured with the questions that the panelists were given. You just might not have, we won't be revisiting any of the panel conversations. We just don't have time, but we will if you missed your panel, and we still have a few panels left. So if you haven't been on a panel, you should know when your panel is coming up, but I just wanted to give a note to the folks that might have missed theirs that have already gone by. So again, we're sticking in these three right now, analyzing the effectiveness through these conversations, analyzing disproportionate impacts of mandatory reporting and alternative process and services for children and families. So again, coming through those conversations of what would you suggest as an alternative reporting method and capturing those pieces. If you want to go to the next slide, Jordan, we'll keep going. And one more. So those are all of our directives. A lot of work ahead of us, as you can imagine. But once we get through these key conversations, we'll really be rolling. So again, we're sitting on August 2nd. Who makes the calls? And Doris will speak a little bit more to this nuance, but we know one of our panels today, there's a little bit of a nuance as to why we grouped you the way that we did into the who makes the calls. So today you're going to hear from our folks that we've kind of, gathered as the advocacy panel. We'll give them a chance to introduce themselves. And then we have the legal and law enforcement panel. Legal law enforcement panel will go first, and then we'll go into the advocacy panel. We're going to take a shift in September. So we're shifting away from who makes the calls into who receives the calls. So again, with member panels there, And then we're going to round out our member panels on the October 4th meeting with who monitors the system. So once we get through that October meeting, we'll then shift our format away from these kind of member panels and these variety of perspectives, and we'll kind of get into different pieces of the work. And then we're also going to move directly into the report review. And so we're going to be taking all those summaries, all these meetings. We've got a lot of work ahead of us. Jordan was out for the month of July studying for the bar and crushed the bar from what I heard. So Jordan is back, and we quickly put her back to work. So welcome back, Jordan. And we're going to be kind of on the sprint to November and December to make sure that that report really reflects all the work that you all have done. So I'm going to pause there. There's a lot of talking. You can take the slides off, Jordan, if you don't mind. And any questions from our team too, Stephanie, Doris, Jordan, Alexis, anyone have any additions that I'm missing as far as kind of where we've been, where we're headed, and any folks from the task force have questions? Amazing. Wow. They're like, no more questions. Stop talking. Okay. All right, cool. Okay, so I think pretty straightforward. Again, this is, I keep telling Stephanie this. I said, I'm in a lot of spaces with a lot of panels, and I love this one so much because you all are so engaged and you're making our work not easy, but really incredible. And I feel like we're doing it with good integrity because we're able to move things forward because y'all are engaged. You're showing up on time. Our attendance is high. So just want to give a shout out to everyone on this task force because we've got a lot of work to do, and I really appreciate we have such a solid team doing it. So with that, Doris, speaking of solid team, I'm going to hand it over to you, my solid counterpart, to introduce our first panel for today, and let's get into the conversations.
Awesome, fantastic. Thank you, Trace. So as Trace mentioned, we're going to kick it off with folks that we have sort of categorized in this legal and law kind of broad category of individuals, and I'm careful to not call them mandatory reporters because there's some questions about what the role could or should be with some of the individuals that we'll have on our panel today. So we have 5 panel members. Leanna Gavin has already shown up on our pin, and then we have Ashley Chase, Carlos Castillo, Kevin Bishop, and Jill Cohen, who will be joining us today. And we'll dive in to some of the nuance related to folks in the legal community, because we know that many individuals, many groups, organizations in the legal community that work with kids and families have started bringing on social workers as part of their legal teams, and that social worker role, which sort of like has typically existed like not in partnership necessarily within the legal field, has created an interesting legal question around whether they should be considered mandatory reporters. And so as we think about mandatory reporting laws as they exist today, wanted to have this conversation to bring in just a lot of the nuance and considerations that we have to be thinking about within the law and ensuring that there is clarity and appropriateness. And so thought it would be great to kind of have this mix of team today to engage in what we think will be a robust and interesting conversation, and ensure that all of you have really interesting points to make. So with that, I'm going to just sort of call on you to do a little bit of a round robin of who you are and just kind of your initial thinking around this effectiveness question as it relates to your role and the way that the law is sort of framed out today, and some of the potential pain points and challenges that exist. So I'm going to begin with you, Leanna.
Good morning. My name is Leanna Gavin. I am an attorney, a family law attorney with the law firm Kalantar. I am based in Denver, but I handle family law cases all over the state, really. And I'm primarily representing parents in divorce cases and custody cases, post-decree cases. Sometimes there is criminal or DNN involvement. So that does intersect a little bit with what I do. I also, before kind of switching into domestic relations, I have done dependency and neglect work. So I've represented parents in DNN cases, and I've done a little bit of GAL work in DNN and juvenile delinquency cases. And prior to that, before I moved to Colorado, I actually did volunteer as a CASA in Northwest Arkansas. So I've played a few different roles in the child welfare system, but my current role is representing parents. And so I think in terms of my take and my perspective, I am, I'm working with a little bit of a different demographic than I think some other folks on this team, and just a different approach in terms of how the domestic relations court approaches child safety issues versus how, families who say can't afford a private attorney or, don't have the resources, I think are more likely to be engaged with law enforcement and DHS in kind of a different way than some of the folks that I currently represent. So I can speak a little bit to the differences there and my thoughts on the different approaches.
Awesome. Thank you, Leanna. I called you Leanne earlier. I left off the A. My apologies. Leanna. Jill.
Hi, good morning. My name is Jill Cohen. I work at the Office of Respondent Parents Counsel. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and have been working on legal teams with attorneys who represent parents for over 20 years in New York and in Colorado. And I have also really been the one to talk to social workers about what it's like to join our legal teams, especially when they make the transition from working, for example, at the Department of Human Services or at a mental health facility, and just the different nuances of now what it's like to work alongside an attorney. And really, I mean, I think other people will talk about this. I'm sure Kevin will. But really, for the social workers who are paired with attorneys who represent either parents accused of abuse and neglect, or parents who are navigating domestic violence, civil protection orders, or people who are charged with crimes. Our ability to be a true team and to have total confidentiality is our biggest asset. People will not tell us what they need and what's happening in their lives if they feel that we will report in the same manner as a caseworker may report to the court. And so navigating some of the ethical issues that arise has been something that I've spent a lot of my career considering. And it's no secret, I think a couple of years ago when there was the reporting bill and there was testimony, we supported the carve out for forensic social workers to be accepted from the requirement to report. And that said, one thing that I've just want to make it really, really clear is that even though I've been a social worker working with lawyers for 20 plus years, I've never left a family in harm's way. And I think that's really important that, my ethics as a social worker are quite strong. And obviously my ethics as a human and as a parent and as a colleague and as somebody who is like as transparent as possible. I won't say that I've never struggled with how to handle a situation, but I've always been able to find the right resources and come to a safe decision that was supportive of my client. And so just putting that out there in case that the discussion goes there, if anybody wants to ask any questions about that.
Awesome. Thank you, Jill. And I love that you bring this this perspective from the sort of legal field as well as from social work, sort of bringing both of those lenses into the conversation. Kevin?
Hi, I'm Kevin Bishop. I am also a licensed clinical social worker. I'm the social worker coordinator for the Office of the Alternate Defense Counsel, and the Office of the Alternate Defense Counsel is conflict counsel for the Public Defender's Office. And I sit on the task force in the seat that is either for ADC or the Public Defender's Office. I am also the first point of contact for social workers who work as members of criminal defense teams, public criminal defense teams here in Colorado. And I would echo a lot of what Jill had said too. One thing I think that's important to consider from our perspective, and particularly with the criminal system, is that the US Constitution provides for in the Sixth Amendment for an attorney to represent clients who can't afford attorneys. And it's because of this that clients who can't afford attorneys get them, and that those attorneys represent their clients zealously and uphold attorney-client privilege and confidentiality, including everybody who is on their team. And so it's our position that we as social workers who are working hand in hand with the teams in a hand-in-hand model, which our office does, and I know the other offices do too, are also covered by attorney-client privilege and confidentiality. We do also, I've been working in this field the same as Jill since 2004, and we do handle ethical dilemmas as they come up. Mandatory reporting in and of itself, I believe, is an ethical dilemma. There are few good choices when it comes to what to do, because I think oftentimes making a report can create harm. Also, not making a report, I know, gives concern to the safety of the child too. But I would say that we are held by attorney-client privilege and confidentiality based in a constitutional mandate.
Awesome. Thank you, Kevin. I want to come back to in our conversation here in a little bit that the ethical dilemma piece, because I think that will be an interesting conversation. Thank you. Ashley?
Hi, I'm Ashley Chase. I'm a staff attorney and the legislative liaison at the Office of the Child's Representative. So we are also one of the independent agencies in judicial. We oversee attorneys who represent the best interests of children or the children themselves in dependency, neglect, juvenile delinquency, and 11 other case types. I have been a practicing attorney for 16 years and was a practicing guardian ad litem for 11 before joining the OCR. I didn't know we were just going to dive right into this. This is exciting. From my perspective as an attorney, I believe the social worker is part of my legal team. They have some agency if they are going to be part of my office. I believe they're subject to my ethical rules and obligations, because if they weren't, frankly, I couldn't work with them. I could not have them talk to my client. I could not have them be a part of the team. I could not share confidential information with them. It would be pretty catastrophic to this multidisciplinary law model, which is considered a national best practice and kind of standard operating procedure. So I'm a little bit more black and white, I guess, because I'm from the attorney side. I know that there's some ambiguity in the law, which we could certainly address, but I mean, I think it's so fundamental to the practice that, and as an attorney, there really is no wiggle room there for us to be able to do this, because our rules of confidentiality are the foundation of our representation and incredibly important to our work as an attorney.
Thank you, Ashley. Yeah, we just dive right in here.
Yeah, I like it.
All right, fantastic. Carlos, rounding out the panel. So you're grossly outnumbered by attorneys and folks working in the representation arena of the legal field. But would love to just have you introduce yourself and recognizing that you kind of represent in part the folks who take the call, because we know that law enforcement in some instances will take reports of child abuse and neglect. And I think that there's some themes that you can offer in terms of just your law enforcement perspective in the kinds of cases that get reported or incidents that get reported, and just the nuance that brings. So turning it over to you to introduce yourself, Carlos.
All right, thank you, Doris. Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm Carlos Castillo. I'm with Denver Police Department, and specifically it's the MEP unit, Missing and Exploited Persons unit, which involves 2 missing person detectives and 7 child abuse detectives. And so myself and my partner, Sergeant Brian Carter, supervise the unit. And so just a quick background, I've been with the department for 20 years. So I've been on the front end, as Doris said, from taking the initial report as a patrol officer, and then I was a detective for 6 years. And so I was also investigating the reports, and specifically in the child abuse unit, and now as a supervisor for it. So the topic of mandatory reporting is something that we work with every day, and specifically we get all kinds of reports. A lot of it, I would say maybe, so every morning we get the whole list of all the reports that patrols have taken throughout the whole city, and it could be something for information only. For example, hey, we ran into this family. These are the concerns that we have. It didn't rise to any that they felt criminal level, and so I passed that information on to social services, and then others, kind of a whole range from child neglect, child abuse, sex assault, allegations, attempt, all that kind of, all those topics. So part of what I love about this particular position is that I work with an MDT. So that involves the district attorney, the medical staff, the forensic interviewers or the CACs, and the social workers. And so every morning, as right now my partner is taking part in the 8:30 meeting, we are all sitting in a conference table and we talk about the cases that are here for today. So I love being part of this task force because, as Dora said, I'm outnumbered today, but I love the perspective that everybody brings, because there might be this idea that law enforcement is kind of single-minded, trying to focus on just maybe arrest or the prosecution side of things, when really I can honestly say that we do work as a team with everybody involved. And many times the best solution has nothing to do with law enforcement or anything criminal. And when we can get everybody's perspective and information, we can make an informed decision, and move forward on what is the best for the family, for the child. And so that's what I like.
Awesome. Thank you, Carlos. I'm actually gonna kick off the discussion, keeping you with the mic, Carlos, because I want to talk or hear from you a little bit about just any of the themes that you see related to reports that are coming in. So we'll look at the data here later on this morning from Casey, but nationally, when you kind of look at who's making the reports, whether they're screened in or screened out, law enforcement, typically in many systems across the country, the reports coming from law enforcement tend to be screened in for investigation, and then all of the things that happen after that. So I would love to hear from you a sense of what are some of the concerns that get reported on thematically, and to what extent do they align with some of what we've heard previously around concerns about the safety of the child, desire to connect the families with families and children with just resources and not knowing where else to call, and concerns about legal liability. So would love to just hear from you anything thematically that in your tenure in law enforcement that you've seen.
That's a good question, Doris. It really has, my experience, it kind of goes in phases. As far as maybe this week, there might be a lot of reporting on, let's just say, violence in the home, maybe with guns. Right now, youth and guns is a big topic. And then the following week, it might be different. And then over the years, some topics have become more common than others. For example, fentanyl right now is very big by the use of family members, and then the children being exposed to them. As I mentioned, youth violence. And whereas just say maybe 5 years, 10 years ago, with the introduction of marijuana in Colorado, that was more prevalent. And you still see some of that, but maybe not as much as the public in general have been more educated and have been able to deal with that now within the whole system. What else? Family violence has kind of always been there in one form or another. And so we really do, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it really does vary. I mean, from, I don't want to downplay it, from the typical child abuse or neglect to up to like maybe an active sex assault case. Right now, there's been some higher population of migrant families, and so that seems to be kind of on the forefront right now. And the interesting, I guess, topics that come up with that, in particular, culture. What is the culture that's okay in South America or somewhere else that's really kind of common to them, and it's not okay here. And so what do we do with that? Like, did it rise to a criminal level, even though they thought it was normal or not? And so that's been a topic. What else? I feel like I'm rambling a little bit, but
Yeah,
does
no
that answer
worries.
some of your question, Doris?
It does. And I want to bring in Leanna and Kevin. One of the things that you mentioned, Carlos, the last point that you made is just some of the nuance in new migrant communities or refugee communities that there may be some cultural differences. And Leanna, you mentioned that you've had the experience of working with communities that more indigent communities, and sort of providing representation for them, and and now being private counsel, and some of the differences that you've experienced there. And what's surfacing for me is some of the disproportionality, and just sort of thinking about how circumstances both might be differently interpreted based on cultural differences, and then also thinking about the different levels of intervention when we're talking about differences in socioeconomic status and the like. And then Kevin, you also mentioned just sort of working with different populations, and sort of the right to counsel, and which means that you're not hiring private counsel necessarily. And so I would love to, I'll start with you, Leanna, and just you had mentioned wanting to be able to come back and speak to just some of the differences that you've seen in your representation, and bring that disproportionality or differences into the conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Doris. I think there's kind of a tendency. So as private counsel, you tend to work with kind of different situations. When I was doing dependency and neglect work, most of my clients were struggling with housing insecurity or homelessness, drug abuse, fentanyl use, some of the stuff that Carlos was talking about, family violence. Another thing that I think is relevant is that, most of the parents I represented when I was in RPC had some sort of a disability, whether it be a physical disability, a mental disability, an intellectual disability. And that was something, as their attorney, that I had to help them navigate, and rights that I had to protect. And there also are kind of these cultural issues that, Carlos is talking about, where if you have, either a judge or a lawyer or an expert or, somebody on the case who is not culturally competent, who does not have the knowledge base or the education to be able to understand when something is a safety concern versus just their perception of what good parenting is, that can really cause issues when it comes to making determinations about whether a call needs to be made, whether a petition in DNN needs to be filed, what needs to happen to protect these children, and does anything need to happen, and are these children actually in danger? In the cases that I work with now in private practice, there are a lot of similar issues. We see a lot of substance use. We see a lot of family violence. But the way the court approaches it with, an affluent family, or, a white family versus a Black family, or, a mixed race family, for example, I think the court approaches it differently. And I think that implicit bias and unfortunately sometimes explicit bias comes into play. One of the things the differences that I was going to speak to is that there's kind of a different trajectory with a divorce case versus like a DNN case, because usually there's not state intervention when I'm brought onto a case. Like DHS has not gotten involved, even though there may be a safety issue. And so when somebody comes to me and says, I have these concerns about my spouse or, the other parent of my children, and I'm calling a lawyer, and paying a lawyer to talk to you rather than making a hotline call or telling a mandated reporter, then we can use some different interventions. We can get, court-ordered therapy for the children. We can have an emergency motion to restrict parenting time. We can have a parental responsibilities evaluator or a child family investigator brought on to address some of the safety concerns without anybody, before it reaches the point of someone has to call the police or someone has to make a hotline call. But I also think that, with affluent white families and some of these different demographics, they're less likely to have a call made on them than, for example, a family who is, their country of origin may not be the US, or they speak a different language, or they have disabilities in the family. Those, families are treated differently in the system and don't have some of the resources that are available to families who hire private attorneys.
Awesome, thank you. Kevin, I saw you nodding a lot. Is there anything that you would add?
No, I love kind of her perspective too, from the sense that, when we get involved and when we have the opportunity to meet clients, part of our role is to make those connections to resources. The question about whether we would make a report in order to get resources for somebody in my office, and I know in the public defender's office too, the person who's getting the resources is usually the social worker who's on the team. We work with folks who are deemed by the state indigent, and I think it's no news to anyone that the majority of people who are in the system disproportionately who are charged with crimes are people of color. And also is true with people who are involved in DHS and the system too. And so we share a lot of the same clients, and there's I don't think there's any argument about the disproportionality and the unfairness of the system. And I think that one of the larger questions can be about how we as a society help people and work with people who have been unfairly disadvantaged from the beginning. And it, to me, does not come from separating families and from further breaking up the social fabric.
Thank you. One of the things that bubbled up for me when Leanna, you were speaking, and some of what you added, Kevin, is that there is this idea that that child abuse or neglect when you see it, for the most part, and so like making the report makes sense. But the reality is that we know that the exact same circumstance, depending on who the people are, who the family is, what they look like, the language that they speak, the resources that they have, that shades how the exact same situation gets interpreted. And I think that, that sort of goes to this, this idea that, no, they're like, it's not like objective reality, and then you make the report. And Leanna, you talked in your survey you mentioned that, that there should be some alternative mechanism for getting families services that they need without necessarily the intrusion, into your point, Kevin, of sort of breaking up the social fabric of the family, giving, kind of like the compounding efforts of disadvantage. Would love to hear from any of you, really, but I'll start with you, Leanna, on what kinds of ideas or thoughts did you have in mind in thinking of what an alternative might be?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, it's hard to really articulate like exactly what it would look like. But I think, as many people have talked about throughout, the various meetings we've had on this task force and the different panels, there is a difference between being poor or, experiencing food insecurity or housing insecurity and abusing your children, right? Like, there are these very egregious cases of physical abuse. And some of those cases are not being properly investigated, and people are not making hotline calls and not, protecting those children. And that they're not getting, parents are reporting abuse and they're not getting help. And meanwhile, we have all these parents involved in the court system who, shouldn't be involved in the court system, who just really need to be connected to resources. And maybe a social worker or an attorney is one of those resources, but maybe they don't even have to get to that point. And so I think that there needs to be a distinction. One of the things that this task force is charged with is kind of creating like a guideline or rules about what people are required to report and who is required to report. So I think that, part of this alternate system is that somebody like Jill or Kevin would have a more solid confidentiality with a client, but also there would be a distinction about, what constitutes abuse and neglect. And I think somebody put in the chat, is there a distinction between physical and sexual abuse and neglect? And I think the way the law is currently written, it's kind of all lumped into this one category, and all of those hotline calls go to the same, they lead you into the same system, which can just create further problems. So I think that we need to have an alternative where, families who just need resources, where the child is not being physically or sexually abused or, physically neglected. Maybe it's they need food, maybe they need, housing resources. Those types of things should not be handled by law enforcement, or really shouldn't create a court case if we can help avoid that. And another point, I think, and Carlos talked about, how drug use and fentanyl use is a huge issue right now. And there are, I know that, and some of the data that we've been presented in this task force, there have been deaths of children who, were exposed to fentanyl. I've seen that in my work too, where children are exposed to that, and it's very serious. But on the other hand, we heard a lot from the panel where folks had lived experience as both children and parents in the system, their perspectives on how to handle substance use in these cases where parents are struggling with that, I thought was really telling, because that does not necessarily warrant removal of the child, and removal should be avoided anywhere possible. So I think we need to have a separate system that contemplates, a more narrow set of circumstances where the child is removed, and really avoiding removal whenever possible. And if a parent has a substance use issue, or the issue is lack of access to resources, then we need to get them in touch with those resources, and maybe have, a social worker or somebody involved with them, again, with that protection of confidentiality, to make sure that they follow through and that the children are safe. But we don't need this level of intervention with the families where children are being removed because, that somebody, that the child was sleepy or the child's clothes were dirty. That doesn't warrant, to me, going in and breaking up this family, or calling the police. I think we need to have a distinction between neglect and abuse.
Thank you. One of the things that I really appreciate about this whole group of panelists is that both that you have like multiple lenses and just the roles that you have played in your careers. And also, each of you mentioned the use of some sort of multidisciplinary kind of teaming, like you have social workers, or you are a social worker. Carlos, you talking about using multidisciplinary teams as you look at reports that have come in, and they're, just sort of taking this holistic approach in, trying to understand and get at what are the just sort of the complexity of needs. So it's, you're not just a lawyer representing a client, you have social workers who, kind of who are part of the team. But that sort of creates this, I think particularly for the lawyers, some unique questions where the law as to, for you, Ashley, it's black and white, but where the law as to mandatory reporting doesn't have that explicit language that says if you are working in this capacity, then you fall outside of the mandatory reporting requirement. So I want to dig into that a little bit, just in terms of, what your thinking is in looking at, all of the, I think it's now, upwards of, 40 different roles that are considered mandatory reporters. That number's not exactly precise, and I don't have it right in front of me. But I think it's near 40. Sort of thinking about the social workers that work within, kind of as part of a legal team. And then also kind of related to that, when you are an attorney that is not working in that particular capacity, and you're working on, say with like a youth advisory council, or you're serving in, kind of more of an advocacy role and have encounters or interactions with kids and families, how that kind of nuance plays into your responsibilities around mandatory reporting. And I'm not going to call on anyone. I'll just open the floor for anyone who wants to initially respond if my sort of two sort of related questions make sense.
I also think there's some interesting stuff in the chat that I think I'll leave to Ashley to answer too. On multidisciplinary teams, I mean, the point of a multidisciplinary team is that there's people coming from different perspectives, and also that carry different sets of ethical rules and values too. I do think that the social worker code of ethics does pair really nicely with the attorney's code of ethics as well. There's some areas where it's a little bit gray for sure, and from the social work perspective, but I think that within the practice, the attorney has to have the ultimate say in what happens, and that their ethics do overcome and kind of guide sort of the social worker's actions. It doesn't mean that we don't have conversations with clients. It doesn't mean that we don't have conversations within the team about what the best approach is. And we come together as a multidisciplinary team, or an interdisciplinary team, really, to come up with a solution that is the best melding of both practices and all of the people on the team. Carlos can probably talk to you too about how that has happened on the teams that he's worked on. But I think that considering all of the information, considering all of the factors that play into cases is really important.
Thank you, Kevin. Jill?
Well, I thought a lot about the overlap between social work ethics and attorney ethics over the years. And, in Colorado, attorneys may report things that they feel are put people at imminent risk or danger. And in my experience, the thing that they mostly struggle with reporting isn't around child abuse and neglect or physical abuse. It's around self-harm or threats to other people. And I think all of us have navigated that. Since attorneys may report, they get to decide if they feel that it reaches the threshold to report. Therefore, a member of their team also would be covered by that if the two were discussing it and made a joint decision around that. And that's something that I think, attorneys have been dealing with forever, no matter who they're working with. It could be, attorneys work with paralegals all the time. And if social workers are forced to report at a different standard than attorneys just won't work with social workers. And so then the person that you're serving or the family you're serving will no longer have access to a social worker who has a lot of access to resources at a really high level. And paralegals can have access to resources, peer advocates can have access to resources and aren't mandatory reporters, but having the social worker on the team really brings, I think, the level of clinical intervention to a higher level, and families just wouldn't benefit from it. They just, an attorney would just say, you know what, I don't want to, have to navigate this with a social worker who may have to report, and therefore I'm going to work with somebody who has less experience, who isn't a mandated reporter like a paralegal. So I think about that a lot. And I also think about how, at least for OCR and ADC, OPD, our office, we have the resources to have social workers on teams who really do spend the time to get to know the person that they're serving and they're representing at a really, really significant level and have high engagement with that person. And actually other system players often call us and ask us to help with things that parents and families and adults and children won't talk to them about, right? Like a caseworker could say, this person doesn't trust me. They know I write a report to the court and I'm reporting on everything that they're doing. Can you talk to them about these two concerns that I had during my last home visit? So that also leads to us having the resource. I feel that if I'm a social worker and I have the resource to help the person address the issue, I should be permitted to do so without reporting them. And then second of all, I think that it's duplicative if lawyers and lawyers agents are reporting at the same level as other mandatory reporters. It's just duplicative. And one thing I wrote about in my survey is that it is highly unpredictable what will happen if you make a call. And all of us probably have some distrust of the system. I'll speak for myself. I have distrust of the system because I have seen reports on the same family on the same issue being made in two counties, and one would be treated with the children staying at home and services being provided, and the same exact situation could be a removal in another county. That erodes trust in the system. And I have experienced that. And so my system trust is eroded. So I don't know what will happen if I make a report, and therefore my efficacy with clients is I have to tell them that. I have to be transparent about that.
Thank you. Ashley?
Well, I feel like there might be a lot of misunderstanding about what the attorney rules are, because it's just not as all encompassing, I think, as everybody is getting to. Lawyers cannot reveal information given to them relating to the representation of their client unless the client gives consent, or there's some very narrow exceptions that have to do with imminent harm. So it's not like an attorney can never reveal. If there's something truly dangerous, imminently going to harm somebody, then we may report. So again, when we talk about these legal teams being subject to the attorney rules, that's different for different attorneys. So all attorneys have ethical obligations. So district attorneys may have a little bit of different rules than public defenders. My guardians ad litem owe their duties of loyalty and confidentiality to the best interest of the child, whereas my counsel for youth owe it to the child themselves. So there's some nuances here. But at the end of the day, the lawyer's team has to be subject to the lawyer's ethical obligations in order for the lawyer to work with them. That's just the reality of what has to happen. But what this means, one, an attorney, because of that confidentiality, these families may come forward or these clients may give us information they are going to give no one else. And so the fact that if you take away that confidentiality, we won't get the information. So you're not solving whatever problem it is you think you're going to solve by making us mandatory reporters, because we're just not going to get the information. By getting the information, we can either, that is helpful because we can then counsel a client about how to help themselves. We can help them make a report. We can connect them to resources. We have a variety of things that we can do. And this ties back into what Jill said before. She's never left a family in danger, because when you get the information, you can then do something with it as the attorney. I can't go tell everybody about it, but I can do something about it as an attorney, or I can get consent. Maybe my client wants help. And so I can get consent and I can then help them make the report or whatnot. If there's imminent harm, I may be able to make the report myself. If the social worker sees something, they're going to come to the legal team, they're going to staff it as a team, and it's just going to be governed by my rules as the attorney of what we can and can't do. But we have a lot of options. Also, when it comes to reporting, I, as an attorney, am just being told stuff. I'm not observing it myself. So I don't know if you've ever made a call. I mean, all of you, a lot of you have made a call to the hotline, but if I'm not the person observing it, they don't take me seriously anyway. So, you know, when we get, I think people get a little bit panicked about the idea that an attorney is not a mandatory reporter, but when you really look at it, it makes a lot of sense. And I will tell you, I think 48 states or something like that, some huge number, I did the research when this task force was first started, have an exception for legal teams. I mean, it is just like fundamental to the practice. So it's really not odd. And I know that there are some exceptions in some places. So I just wanted to, I don't know, clarify that a little bit, because I do think people have a little bit of a misunderstanding about what attorneys can and can't do, or, you know, so this idea that we get information as like a private citizen, that has nothing to do with our duties of confidentiality. They attach to a client. It has to do with what we find in that representation. So if my best friend throws her kid off the dock and like beats somebody, like, of course I can report that. I'm a person. I'm not like forever forbidden from talking about things. So if I get information not within a legal representation or within a protected relationship, those rules don't apply. So it's just when I'm talking about those legal teams, when you're talking about a case and you have a client and you have the rules, that sort of ethical bubble kind of attaches.
Thank you for that, Ashley. So I want to come back to like the you know, we have this you know, couple of questions about like how narrow or broad that you know, kind of the legal rules apply, and sort of I think the clarification around whether there should be these like, you know, very explicit carve outs or exceptions to privilege in that relationship. So I appreciate you clarifying one, just, you know, kind of how narrow and the fact that it attaches, but I think also just coming back to something that you and Jill shared about, you know, kind of having these teams allows you, and this sort of special relationship allows you to, one, get information that might not otherwise be gained because of the nature of trust that's baked into that relationship, but also just having the ability to you know, sort of tap into services and supports, which ultimately are, you know, that's one of the reasons for making the report, right? Like, so when you look at mandatory reporting laws, like the whole point is to get the report made so that families can get the services that they need, so that kids can be protected. Well, so that kids can be protected. And sometimes that means getting families the services and supports that they need. And so if there's another way to achieve that, I think that's worth hearing and talking about. And what I appreciate about again about this whole group is the recognition of the value and importance of having you know, these, you know, interdisciplinary, as you put it, Kevin, these teams that can actually engage with the client and in nuanced kinds of ways, and ultimately, you know, kind of, you know, remediate the kinds of concerns that, you know, that may rise to the level usually of neglect, but that are really about, you know, underlying, you know, needs more than willfulness on the part of the parent. So I appreciate you adding that. I'm trying to check the chat real quick. Love, Ashley, that you included some specific language for how the exception can be written as this task force, you know, will ultimately be charged with some very specific recommendations, and that could be one in terms of the law and specific carve outs. I want to come back to this the question around or some of the comments that you made, Ashley, about if you're not serving in a particular client representation capacity, then the attorney rules don't apply. And how you might, and this is for, maybe the whole of, maybe it's you and Leanna, but like for the, and Jill, so maybe for the whole of the group, kind of how you like articulate that particular piece of the exception or lack of exception. Like, so if you're not functioning in an actual representation role, is that just like that last line, Ashley, in your in what you put in the chat, that like if you're functioning in this legal representation, then the exception applies. But if not, if you're a normal citizen or you're still in a professional role but not working, not in a representing a particular client, then it doesn't apply.
Right. Yeah, I think the idea of the language that I proposed would be to keep this narrow in the spirit of the purposes of mandatory reporting, but also, so it's kind of like bridging that gap of, if you are a social worker or somebody who has mandatory reporting duties and you are operating in your normal course of action, then of course you should, be subject to your mandatory reporting. If you are one of those people who are acting as an agent or part of a legal team, then, your duty goes to the legal team. But to keep that narrow, because of course, so you don't want to silence somebody who would want to report and they all of a sudden can't because they work with a legal team, but they're doing something else not related. That doesn't make any sense. I mean, again, as a citizen, I can report if my ethical duties aren't applying. So you'd want to just make sure that is narrow for everyone else who's on that legal team. So whatever hat you wear when you're not on the legal team is the hat you are responsible for. But when you're on the legal team, this would be the very clear black and white rule, if that makes sense. And it's interesting, Doris, because I think I hear people talking so much in this group in the last couple panels about child abuse and neglect and like one or the other. In my world, in my office, I guess, maybe I shouldn't say world, we think of it more like safety. So when it rises to the level of actually impacting safety versus other issues. So a lot of like poverty issues and some of these other issues, they don't rise to like a true safety issue. They're concerning, they need help. Yes. But this idea of safety is kind of where we land a lot in our conversation. So I just say that because I think as we're trying to suss out, I see people thinking in tech or in chat about how do you differentiate between abuse and neglect? I mean, I think a lot of the times what we really need to focus on is safety versus other things where families need help. So just 2 cents to add in.
Awesome. Thank you. We're going to take Kevin and then we are going to turn it over to the advocacy panel.
I just wanted to support Ashley and say that I agree with all of that. And I think that the role piece of it is what makes it so important that we keep it to kind of when we're doing this work, it's specific to our client. And anything that we've learned during the course of representation is bound and held to attorney-client privilege and confidentiality. And then also too, I love the discussion around safety, particularly because it is the attorney's obligation to consider that, and to, if there is something to be done, that's where their decision making is. That also applies to us too. As social workers as well. And so it does take a lot of the question about, whether I like what somebody is doing or not, or believe it to be, kind of where the subjectivity, I guess, taking some of the subjectivity out of it.
Awesome. Thank you. I think that's a good note to sort of, I think, chew on as we continue to have these conversations. I think leaning on this question around safety versus physical abuse, sexual abuse, I think those are easy. It's where the neglect piece comes in, and distinguishing safety from these underlying issues. And then I want to just sort of flag that we've had prior conversations. One of the themes that has come up is around training and developing, kind of the skill set across the mandatory reporter group around what are the kinds of things that really do necessitate reporting to a child abuse and neglect hotline versus through some other route. And I think that that safety question, obviously in my mind would fall into that. And so I think more discussion around how that could be fleshed out and what the training support needs would be to help kind of just identify what are in fact safety concerns versus other family needs. With that, thank you all of you so much for your insights and perspectives. I think it's really helpful, as this task force really grapples with not just these broader questions, but also some of the nuance that applies where you're thinking about different categories of potential mandatory reporters and making it clear who falls in or outside of that. And ultimately, what are we trying to do is keep kids safe. And I think in doing so, ensuring that their families have the needs that they have their needs met in order to effectively do so. Thank you all for your insights and perspectives. And looking forward to continuing to hear more from you and the rest of the group as we grapple with these important issues. Turning it over to you, Trace.
Perfect. Thanks all. So that was a lot. It was a fantastic discussion. I'm going to make a little bit of a shift in the agenda. I think we need a little bit of brain space before we dive into the next conversation. Feels like a lot to just go directly into another panel, Doris. So what I'm going to suggest is we're a little bit ahead of schedule because we started early. So let's come back at, oh gosh, I'm in Oakland. So it's 9:09 in Colorado. I'm in Oakland for the week for work. So let's come back at 9:15 and just take a little bit of a headspace break, get some water, take care of yourself, go off camera, and then we'll rejoin with the advocacy panel. Thanks, folks. All right, y'all, we're going to come on back. Give folks a minute. Roshan, I'm going to go ahead. I see you first, so you're going to be spotlighted alongside me. Let's see here. Gina, see you back. Gonna bring you in. Hi, Gina. Gina, where are you located? Are you?
I'm here in Toyac.
Oh, you are in Toyac. Okay, awesome. Do you know Sherelle Lang?
I do.
You do. Our Yoni on my team works with her quite a bit. So I'm always hearing her name. Very cool. All right, Jennifer, there you are. Okay, looks like folks are. Okay, great. So again, thanks to everyone that participated on our legal and law enforcement panel. I'm excited to move into the advocacy space, and I'm excited for you all to define what that means, because as you were answering the different survey responses, there was a lot of overlap in your answers, but also some important nuances that I want to make sure to draw out from your unique perspectives. I'm thinking about this conversation. Well, actually, let's do intros and then I'll kind of talk around how I'm thinking about framing this conversation. So would love to hear who you are, where you're located in the state, your role at your organization. And I also just want to hear from you why you, real quick, like broadly, like why you're on this task force. Maybe someone volunteered you to, so don't worry about it. That's the answer. Let's move into, like, from your perspective, what really like brings you to the excitement of supporting this kind of like intense work of the mandatory reporting task force. So am I saying it right with Roshan?
It's Roshan, actually way easier than it looks.
Okay, I'm so glad I asked. So Roshan, I apologize. Thank you.
No, not at all.
No. So Roshan, go ahead and why don't you start, and then we'll move on to Jennifer after that.
Hi, everyone. My name's Roshan. My pronouns are she and hers, and I'm the executive director at Violence Free Colorado. So we're the state anti-domestic violence coalition. We work closely with both of the agencies that are represented on the panel. So it's exciting to be here with both of you. So our role is to support survivors by supporting advocates. So we work with direct service programs across the state to bring training and technical assistance and do systems change on their behalf. I come to this work through direct service as an advocate and as a psychologist. And so my background is in both. I've worked, I guess I just want to kind of say quickly, I've worked in a variety of settings. So I'm here as a community-based advocate, but I've also spent a lot of time in systems advocacy. So I've worked in hospitals, I've worked with police departments. So I guess I want to say, like, I have that perspective as well. And in those settings, I've been on many multidisciplinary task forces where I was representing one piece. So these conversations about sort of how do you use your license, where are you, how do roles work together without violating or without harming survivors are, I think, really at the crux of everything we're talking about. So I appreciate kind of where the last panel went. And so I'm here mostly because we were a big part of the first legislation, and we advocated for and supported a carve out for domestic violence advocates for a variety of safety reasons, and would still support that, but I'm also happy to be in the conversations with all of you.
Great. Thanks, Roshan. Appreciate you naming the kind of like the nuances there for what brings you to the table. Jennifer, going to move to you, and then Gina after Jennifer.
Thanks, Trace. I'm Jennifer Isle. I am the executive director of an organization called Project Safeguard. We're located in Denver and serve Adams, Arapahoe, and Denver counties, providing legal advocacy and attorney assistance to victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. As an organization, we are members of both of the other programs that are represented, both coalitions, and I serve on the policy committees of both coalitions and was very active in the bill that Roshan mentioned as well, and why we're all here. So I have, throughout my career, I've been doing this work for almost 30 years in the field of gender-based violence, first as a licensed professional counselor and a victim advocate in a confidential space. I worked as a law enforcement victim advocate. I went to law school and I'm an attorney. I've worked as a GAL and a child and family investigator. Stephanie and I work together at the Rocky Mountain Children's Law Center. So I've kind of covered the gamut of roles where I'm both a mandatory reporter and not, and in different systems. I've been in the juvenile justice system, in the civil legal system, a little bit in the criminal legal system, although that's not really my expertise. And so what brought me here was a lot of kind of the same things that Roshan mentioned around concerns with the way that mandatory reporting impacts, particularly survivors of domestic violence, the parents who are protective of their children and are being victimized by an abusive person. And we know, we have research that shows, in fact, that the fact that our victim advocates are confidential victim advocates for whom really the only exception to confidentiality is mandatory reporting of known or suspected child abuse or neglect, prohibits, prevents, discourages folks who need help, who want to get safe and get their children safe from seeking services. So survivors stay in abusive relationships, they don't access services, they take other routes rather than coming to us for help. So I will stop there. Let Gina speak.
Yeah, and Jennifer, I appreciate that. We'll draw some of that out as the particular that came up in all three of your kind of survey responses as a really I don't want to say unique, but like a very specific group of folks to be talking about instead of just kind of this like broad approach to advocacy, right? Like let's actually like say who we are talking about and who you all are advocating for in that. So Gina, I got to kick it over to you and then we'll kind of get going with the larger conversation.
Yeah, great, thanks. I'm Gina Lopez. I'm a member of the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe here in Toyoak, Colorado. I work with the Colorado Coalition Against Sexual Assault. Very different than CASA. We get mixed up with those folks. I just want to make sure we keep that clear. I was voluntold also. I do feel very honored to have taken the place of my colleague who has left. And I believe that the perspective I bring is very appropriate for this conversation. We also join in with Violence Free in the policy support that we had and why we're here. But I come to this work. My position just changed recently. My job title is Systems Response Program Director. And I think that comes from this kind of multifaceted approach to things and stemming from my experience that I bring to the work and the movement. I was a tribal victim advocate here for Ute Mountain for a few years before I moved over to CASA, where I lend my experiences, expertise, and things like that to training and technical assistance for all of our Colorado communities, because I'm a strong believer that there is rarely a community like tribal communities that navigate multi-systems and complications and obstacles, unclear kind of pathways of things. I also facilitated and still do facilitate today a multi-disciplinary, multi-tribal, unfunded coalition of amazing folks in Indian country out here that spans all of the 4 states and at least 5 tribal nations, and have worked with tribal leaders in those communities as well, supporting their community members and their advocates to affect change to address issues that are coming up. So I understand bureaucracy. I understand, those systems that kind of put us in some very unknown spaces. And so I'm here to kind of lend that purview to these questions, which I will echo the folks in the last panel and from other panels about who is subjected to mandated reporting in different ways, who's not being heard in the way that it should have. I myself had tested the hotline for my community, and just like 911, who knows where that call gets routed to. So it's really tough out here. And so again, just want to say that, I believe that if I can navigate something like that, and I still live here in this community, navigating those systems myself and in life, I believe that there are some ways that we can come together and remedy issues in all of our Colorado communities. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Gina. Super honored that you're on this panel with us. So I'm so glad you were voluntold, because I think you're bringing such a unique perspective. I guess my quick question is, do the 3 of you know each other, like outside of this? So y'all 3 have kind of, okay. So we're just getting like the book club back together, and y'all are just like, you're like, yeah, we talk all the time. Okay. I love that. That's amazing. So I want to get clear on something, because it was on, maybe folks on this call are very clear, but I do want to just name it explicitly. In your survey responses, what became a little unclear to me is like what you're, as advocates, like what you're protected by and having to report and what you're not protected by. Can we get clear on that? Because Gina, like your answer, and maybe we can't get clear. Maybe that's the challenge. So let's just like name that. But I just want to throw that out is can y'all speak to those challenges there? Because it honestly was confusing to me as someone reading those responses as to what you are legally required to do in your space of like advocacy, and when you are protected as someone who is a trusted victims advocate, and when you are not, and what that, and I know that is kind of the conversation, but let's just get explicit. So I'm gonna who wants to jump in first? And then, okay, Jennifer, go ahead.
I'll take the lawyer role here and answer that. So Colorado state law carves out a privilege exception for confidential victim advocates that work in programs that specifically serve domestic violence. And when I say domestic violence, because I'm so glad you gave me the opportunity to do this too, because I want to give this definition to folks. We are talking about intimate partner violence. We're not talking about family violence. We're not talking about when grandma hit mom. We are specifically talking about intimate partners when we are talking about domestic violence or intimate partner violence here. So state law lays out confidential privilege for confidential victim advocates in community-based programs. That is different than if someone works in a law enforcement agency, works in a prosecutor's office. They are a systems-based advocate who does not have that privilege. They have no confidentiality. And so first we have that. We have this very, very comprehensive state law that allows us to keep all information that is shared with us by a survivor confidential and not be subpoenaed to court. We also are protected by VAWA, the Federal Violence Against Women Act, that again requires us to keep information confidential, and the Federal Victims of Crime that requires us to keep all identifying information about the folks we serve confidential. So we actually have, as advocates, a greater level of privilege and confidentiality than attorney-client privilege. So when I said like mandatory reporting of child abuse and neglect is basically the only exception That's what I'm talking about.
So it's the neglect piece, not that you don't have that privilege for, is that?
Well, the mandatory reporting of child abuse and neglect.
Okay, all right, I got you. Go ahead, Roshan.
No, I just because I think, so for many people, the carve outs are like self-harm, harm to others, and child abuse and neglect, and that's not the same for DV advocates, and it's confusing, I think, for folks, just to be really honest, because it is such a unique exception. And so, yeah, people are used to sort of hearing there's these three, or there's, and so, just to name that.
And that just reminded me, Roshan, that we also are not required to report abuse of at-risk adults, which for most mandatory reporters, that is also a requirement. We worked very hard and advocated at the legislature to have victim advocates not have that, because we don't want to have an adult victim come to us who is an at-risk adult, is 65. And that is what makes them at risk. And to have to make a report to Adult Protective Services in that case. So we've made a very specific carve out for that. The question from Chris about if there are children in the home under 18, like that, if there's a child, then we're talking about mandatory reporting of child abuse and neglect. But let's say if we had someone who qualified as an at-risk adult come to us and there are no children involved, we would not be required, as other mandatory reporters are, to report that. I know we're not here to talk about that thing today, but since we're trying to be clear about what advocates do and don't have to report, I just want to mention that too.
Yeah, no, I mean, and we are like, I think that, again, I think it is important to be clear, because I'm looking across the task force and people are kind of like, oh, okay, like there's some aha moments happening, I think, for a few folks. So I think it's good to clarify. So with that kind of, and Gina, sorry, did you want to add anything, or?
I will. I'll just add this little piece wherever I can to speak on this experience, which is in state law, advocates can't be subpoenaed. I was subpoenaed in my tribal program. I think it was more strategy than anything. I didn't have to go and disclose anything. But I think that it had to be tested because of the kind of ambiguity that tribal communities and the whole jurisdiction piece is unclear for even our neighboring communities. And I think they had to try it. And it was successful in moving the case the way they wanted, but it definitely became a very, in my opinion, manipulative tactic to get that done. And it was very concerning to me moving forward in our program, how we were supposed to approach confidentiality with folks coming into our program for services. We very rarely made calls to law enforcement for support. We set up relationships much similar to the discussions being had here about multidisciplinary teams working together. We set up understandings with like our clinic to have a special door to bring victims through who are injured, to tend to those injuries, because we don't have the same kinds of options for folks to shelter, to other homing alternatives. And so we really had to navigate choices based on where survivors were coming from and what they felt was best. We truly believe that they were the experts of what was going on. I also want to mention that for our work in sexual violence, teens that kind of live in this really difficult place in terms of age and statute. We hold that space at CCASA for sure, because we understand that, like folks had mentioned before, if we don't have a safe space for folks to come to, namely teens, to speak on their experiences where they can seek services and seek support, we probably won't hear from them. And we kind of understand what that can kind of cycle into larger issues and bigger needs. So just wanted to mention that.
So
yeah,
I just wanted to respond to that, really what you said, Gina. One of the things that bubbled up for me is just the need to make sure that we are continuously thinking about the ways in which sort of like this broader approach uniquely impacts specific marginalized communities like the Native community. And so, you know, as we think about, you know, what potential recommendations will come from this group, we'll have to be thinking about that dual lens, like, you know, sort of like the population writ large, and then also thinking about the unique impacts to specific communities. And so I really appreciate you continuously to bringing that up in this conversation.
Yeah, Doris, that was exactly, I was gonna say, Gina, you know, disproportionate impacts on communities or something, or specific, you know, Black and brown communities are specifically something that this task force has talked about since day one. And so having your unique voice, I think, is something that has been, particularly for like how this affects tribal communities, has been something that we've just been missing. And it's obviously a huge part of the discussion. And so not to put all of that emotional labor on you, but I appreciate your willingness and vulnerability to share that. So thank you for that perspective. And Doris, I'm going to keep you spotlighted because I always appreciate your perspective. So jump in with me here. But I want to move kind of into this, you know, so now that we've kind of clarified a few of those things, again, I don't know that that's like, wow, that's the answer. I'm so clear, but I do think it helps get folks clear on the definition side. I want to just break the rest of our conversation down into the challenges and frustrations piece, what you want folks to hear from your perspective as far as like how this shows up in your work, and just get really clear. You gave some really great examples in your survey. And like I said, we didn't get a chance to send those summaries out. So bring those to life here with your voice. I also think so many of you gave me so much information. It was clear that typing it out was hard. And so I want you to have an opportunity to just give voice of like, you have a group here with open ears. What are the challenges and frustrations as you see it in the mandatory reporting system as it is today, as we're looking at the effectiveness piece, right? And then we'll get into the second half, we'll get into the kind of idea of like alternative reporting methods. I know it sounds like a lot of y'all are creating systems outside of systems. You have like a network of support, you know who to call, you know where to connect families. Obviously that relies a lot on relationships. So like what happens, you know, Jennifer, if tomorrow something were to happen, like, and those aren't, you know, that's not part of the systemic response. Obviously that's a challenge, right? A lot of that relies on your relationships and your navigation of those kind of informal systems. So I want to talk a little bit about that, of like, ideally, what would that look like? So let's start on the challenges and frustration side. Jennifer, I saw your hand kind of go up. So I'm gonna start with you, and then we'll pivot around the group.
Thanks. I wanted to kind of jump off from where Gina left off talking about teens. So both on the teen dating violence side, which is how we talk about intimate partner violence among teens, and on the sexual assault side, we are put in a really awful position of having young people come to us who've been sexually assaulted or who have been victims of teen dating violence, trying to assist them with the resources that we have available. And in the case of Project Safeguard, we might help them with a protection order or something of that nature. Having to make a mandatory report just completely destroys our relationship and our ability to provide meaningful services to those young people. And like I said earlier about how survivors of domestic violence are discouraged from getting help, and that's true for sexual assault as well. People are constantly afraid their kids are going to get taken away. So, you know, across the board in the work that we do, regardless of whether the kids are being directly impacted, if somebody's coming to us about a sexual assault, there's still that fear, because particularly in marginalized communities, you know, if systems get involved and my kids are going to get taken away, it is really a theme that we hear all the time. But I'm going to stop because I could just keep talking. But I really wanted to just name that piece about teens and how that is a particular unique situation we encounter.
Appreciate that, Jennifer. Roshan, if you had the opportunity to, someone's asking you, okay, so tell me what your frustrations, your primary concerns are, and the challenges in your work. What would you want to highlight here?
Yeah, I think, I think one thing to think about is domestic violence is all about power and control, right? And a huge piece of what we do in both sexual assault and domestic violence advocacy is try to, as much as we can, obviously it's not within our power to give power over to somebody, but we try to help people take power back in their relationships in the way they can. And mandatory reporting limits us our ability to do that. So when a client comes to us with their own timeline for safety, so one of the tenets of this advocacy is that the client is the person who knows how to stay alive better than anybody else. If I need to know, if what's the danger level, I can't assess that, but the survivor can. So when they say to me, I need a week, I need a month, I'm coming tomorrow, I'm going to call 4 times before I come in, I need to trust, because that's usually the best way that person's going to get out of the relationship they're in. Or I'm staying because I'm managing violence this way so that I'm not homeless. I'm staying so I'm managing violence this way so that I can feed my children. There's many, like, safety is many things. It's not just one thing. And survivors are always navigating all of those types of safety, and they're making difficult choices every day to keep their children and themselves safe. So I want to trust that survivor. And when I'm required as a mandatory reporter to talk about something outside of our relationship, it immediately puts that system and that timeline in control. And this is a problem for I was a teacher for a long time. It's certainly not the best strategy, I think, for anybody who's experiencing violence or engaged in any kind of difficulty, but it's especially dangerous for domestic violence, especially because we know that the time when you're leaving is the most dangerous. It's when an abuser becomes most out of control and tries to gain that power back in the most violent ways. So if in that moment, when someone's reaching out for help, we're like, by the way, I'm going to call CPS and they're going to come to your door and tell your abuser that you called, we're putting that person in a different level of danger, and we're not helping the children, right? The children don't get something from that system. I think the other piece that sometimes gets lost in these conversations is there's an assumption that a survivor is doing something to harm their children. I'm hoping nobody in this room believes that, but it's definitely part of national conversations that somehow they don't care enough, or they're not working enough to make sure their children are safe. And actually what we hear from survivors all the time is, I stayed because of my kids, I left because of my kids. It's the children that actually push their decision making. So the idea that someone's in a violent relationship and doesn't care about how that's impacting the kids is rarely true. It's usually that what they're trying to do is figure out what's the safest long-term strategy that I can make to keep my children safe over time. And so when we implement something, we take that power away, and we distrust that a survivor has the skills that we see them using every day to survive. The other thing I'll say is, and I think this has been said over and over again, but it puts people into the system without choice. And so obviously for many communities, that's an immediate no. And if they know that we might have to do that, then we're not safe either. So, an advocate becomes an unsafe place because they know that there may be a systems response to reaching out to an advocate. So it cuts people off. There are many people who want to engage in the system. I've made many mandatory reports with a client on the phone when they're saying, please help me. That's the best way to do it, I think, is when you can be in relationships. So it's not like people don't want help. I just want to trust survivors and give them the timeline to be able to do it in the way that they know is going to help them and their children. Because getting the survivor to safety is generally the best thing for the children. Removing the children is almost never the way to bring them into safety. We know putting kids in systems has terrible outcomes, but keeping them with a protective parent is the better choice. We just have to give the protective parent what they need so that they can actually make the change and not push them into decisions that they're not ready to make. Sorry, that was a little bit of a soapbox. I'm going to sit back.
Oh, I was going to say, Roshan, tell us you have an opinion on this. I love it.
Sorry, I'm going to sit quietly now.
Oh, don't be quiet. I love it. You're getting a lot of love in the chat right now. So really appreciate you naming that piece. I'd also just say, I want to put a pin in this idea, and Gina, I want to come to you next to add to this, but, Roshan, I can't remember if it was you or someone else, and I'm seeing the word educating in the chat, and someone explicitly named in the survey that a challenge or part of that like solution side they'd like to see is just more education for the folks involved. So again, right now it's like someone who doesn't work in DV anything, right? Like this is all like, oh, wow. Okay. Interesting. Wouldn't have thought about it that way. Yes. There is a challenge in, I don't know if you want to call it like the media or the perception, right? Of like that the parent that stays just didn't care enough to leave. And so like, just right there, you kind of saying like, actually what we see is that they're actually staying because they think it's the safest option for their family. So I want to kind of dig into that piece around what would educating the folks that are interacting with these families or systems, right? If the system is a necessity, to some degree, what would it look like for folks to be educated on these unique challenges or to trust this timeline that you're suggesting those things? So let's put that on the shelf for now, but I do want to bring up the education piece. Gina, I want to bring you in. We're talking about, kind of challenges as you see it and naming those unique nuances. So would love to hear from you.
Yeah, we only have so much time. But I wanted specifically to talk about this idea of safety. I've been hearing that come up a lot. This idea of systems of safety. I want to bring that back again to not only my community, but our rural communities, where I feel we kind of experience kind of some similar things in that what should be a system of safety doesn't actually apply the same to everyone. And I think we all have that consensus. But specifically, especially if we're talking about education, identity is a huge component of how response looks to victim survivors of sexual violence in our tribal communities. Geography plays an important piece in that. Native survivors in tribal jurisdictions navigate sexual violence and how those things go forward, whether they're adults or children, very differently than anyone else in the country. And so I think there's nuances to that. A lot of the TA calls I get throughout our state from different communities where they come across Native American survivors and their children are around trying to help them understand how identity plays a role within their tribal kind of their homelands in their tribal community. Some folks are in the thinking that, well, if my children are enrolled and recognized as enrolled members of a tribe, then that might somehow give me some leverage here in my domestic violence or sexual assault case in this rural town. The truth is, it may not be the safety that you think it is, the protection you think it is. Tribal membership is not always kind of the best safety in terms of that. If anything, it takes control, another level of control from this parent who's the safer parent or the survivor victim in the situation where those children don't belong to you anymore. They belong to the people, and they'll be returned back to that community as such, where especially if it's determined that there's a violent relationship going on there. Again, another level of what should be a way to kind of bring a family together and keep families together can be destructive in itself in that kiddo's identity and that family's makeup of their identities. There's so much that goes into that thinking, and also when we're talking about kiddos who are experiencing sexual violence as well. It's not always an automatic someone's going to be held responsible. An example I'll share with you is small children under the age of 10 were brought to our program because our law enforcement, who are federal agents, had no law or code to deal with them. In my community, we have no code that addresses sexual assault or child sexual abuse or domestic violence. And so we rely on the kind of federal laws that oversee that. And as hard as that is to hear, those laws don't really come into place. You almost have to practically lose your life. It depends on the severity of the injuries that you're sustaining before it'll be taken into the higher court, which is the U.S. Attorney's Office, to prosecute sex crimes. And as you know, U.S. attorneys, they're taking on all different types of cases, and so if they ever do get a case, it needs to be a slam dunk case to make best use of their time. And oftentimes, especially with the other levels of not only poverty, but addiction and things like that, that folks are coming out of in our communities, that's not going to be a star witness or one that, is probably going to have an easy time getting across in their case. And so oftentimes folks come for services, but it's not going to be the outcome that they're looking for. Justice is not going to look the way that they think it is. And I also want to share that CICASA we were supporters of the kit tracking bill I was a part of an information gathering portion of our work around that, and visited with our neighboring states' kit tracking systems to see how tribal cases show up in that. And the truth is they will never show up in kit tracking processes. And so survivors from our communities that will go through the trouble of getting an examination, getting forensic, getting forensic examinations and evidence and all of that. Unlike other folks, other survivors who are assaulted, those who are unfortunately assaulted on the wrong geographical lines will never have access to their kits the way other survivors will. And that's just the plain fact of it. And so when we talk about systems of safety, I want to name those things that, even though they're established, even though there's statute, even though there's amazing work, policy work to get these laws done, I supported, a lot of things pertaining to my community as well, as far as state statute, the missing and murdered bill. There are just some things that are far out of the reach. And so when we talk about like our local folks, social services folks, our education folks, for my community, our kiddos largely have to go off the reservation to go into public schools. That community has a really hard time kind of doing a work team around concerns with our kiddos, because you can't force, because of tribal sovereignty, you can't force, a tribal community to participate in that. So they have reviews about child abuse and neglect in our neighboring community, and kiddos from our community do come up in their case reviews, but they're kind of just like, they name it and they kind of move on because they have no information to kind of work on these things. So our kiddos are having to come into that community and navigate education without having access to the same resources and potential help, if there is any, that other kiddos might, just because of simply where they live and live. So I just wanted to kind of talk about that piece.
I mean, you're like, I just wanted to put that out there. That's huge. Really appreciate you naming that piece so well and so specifically. I'm putting a pin in my brain around when it comes time for the reporting piece out of this group, and we talk a lot about equity and the unique challenges of like rural versus metro, right? Like ensuring that we really tease that piece out that you're sharing in a unique way and give it enough space, right? So I just appreciate that. There's a lot of work to do there to tease that out more. So I could sit and listen to you all day of those unique challenges. I'm going to keep us moving in this conversation, but really I'm seeing some love for you in the chat. So I hope you see that too. So I appreciate you again sharing that vulnerability. I want to kind of pivot us to the to the looking ahead thing, the waving the magic wand, the what is possible from your perspective. I see so many of you, Roshan, you spoke to the survivors do what they know best. They survive, right? And you all, it sounds like you all do what you do best, which is navigate systems, right? And you make it work. And so would really love to hear from you. And Gina, I'm actually going to come back to you if you got a chance to take a sip of water, hopefully, but I'd love to start with you on this. What would be different, right? Like what sorts of recommendations would you be making with these unique challenges that you just named of what could be better within the mandatory reporting kind of system, or what would you completely scrap, right? Like what, I kind of want to leave this open-ended, but I want to hear from you. So Gina, if you don't mind, I'll start with you, but if you need a minute, happy to move to somebody else. So just let me know.
Can I ask you to repeat the question? My audio went out.
Yeah, no, you're good. You're waving a magic wand. You're doing something to what are the opportunities that you see for change in the system, right? As we're looking at the effectiveness of mandatory reporting and you're talking about these unique challenges, what would you change? What would you recommend? What sort of alternative, we call it like alternative reporting method, but I don't want to just stay in that narrow. I think that can kind of be a narrow box. What do you want to suggest, right? Like what would be different?
Yeah. I think it would be so beneficial to have more open lines of communication, some trust building between communities. I think some time and space, which given resources and you know what responders we have in communities we're talking about, especially smaller ones, right? Do they have the capacity to have these kind of meaningful, kind of multidisciplinary conversations with each other? One where there's an understanding always that we're going to kind of weed through nuances. We're going to take the time for that. We're going to set aside some things and still kind of have respect for one another's role in that. I think taking the time to really kind of, just going to kind of echo what folks were mentioning in the last panel around having some meaningful, thoughtful conversations around it, to sit in spaces of curiosity with each other, and try to kind of be those true systems of safety, if that's what it is we say we're going to do. And I feel like those can look a number of ways. I will always kind of rely on kind of my beliefs and how those things work, even though I will also be transparent in saying I don't believe that that's something that's taking place right now in my community. I wish that it could, but I think we're also pit up against these systems that we have to kind of abide by, that don't allow us to kind of reach back into those roots and sit with each other and in what would be true healing and listening to one another about what that looks like and what it should be. I think we're kind of inundated with all of these requirements around us, and which is kind of the intention of why we're in the situations that we're in, right? So trying to find a way of resiliency and rebuilding what it means to take care of each other and look after each other, I think is going to take a real kind of cross community, cross systems, overcoming of many barriers and challenges. But what I would love to see is a more kind of thoughtful space for folks to sit together and try to come to a place of understanding. I think that's what we have in our multi-tribal, multidisciplinary group, we're called CASA, and we kind of just sit together and we talk about the issues that we're facing, very similar to one another. We're all sitting in these kind of confines of reservation, and yet we are still trying to serve survivors and their families and our communities. And what we find to be the most helpful to one another is at least we can speak to someone who's not kind of siloed in these situations, because it can really feel like it's just me, it's just my people, and it's true. And I think that that's something that can be very helpful across all communities to kind of sit with and say, hey, it's not just me, it's not just my work. What can we do together? How can we support each other? How can we advocate with each other? What I find to be most effective is, a really amazing advocate who's been in her field in tribal communities for 30 plus years is, never go alone. And she said, when you have a survivor come into your program or come to you, I've been out of direct services for about 5 years now. And I still have folks who come directly to my residence because there's just no way to avoid that. But I also don't turn them away because I'm not that. I don't work for my tribe. I can't have that for you. Deep down, we're all in this community together. We're all relatives. We have to look out for each other, and try to find ways to get folks from one stepping stone to the other. And if that's the bare minimum of what we can do for each other, I think it's better than nothing, instead of sitting in an audience and watching violence kind of prevail and cycle itself through our generations. I think just opening up those avenues without putting up those walls of whether it's mandated reporting or that's not my role anymore, or and that comes with a lot of criticism. I'll tell you that. I don't know that I'm always my leader's favorite for doing that, but sexual violence, at least in the agency that I work for, which I truly love and admire everybody I work and our member agencies, is to come from this anti-oppressive lens. And that kind of helps me kind of push through, even within my own community and my leadership, that's where that stuff comes from. And I think that it would be most beneficial that whatever training or work group or remedy or answer we're coming to here, that we always try to base that in this understanding of anti-oppression and what those impacts are. I think that will help us get to a place of reality, and I think it will get us to some really good answers. Maybe not the best answer, but I believe that it will get us moving in a direction.
Thanks, Gina. I appreciate that. You kind of gave me a good opportunity there at the pivot of, like, again, coming back to that education piece, right? Like, what are our training tools, and how are we talking to folks, and when we bring systems together across, lines of difference or lines of commonality, like, in what spirit do we do that sort of convening, and how are folks seeing one another in different systems as resources, right? So I appreciate you naming those pieces. Jennifer, I'm going to come to you. What's the opportunity here? What do you want this group to really consider and understand from your perspective and your professional experience and personal experience, that you would suggest as a alternative method, if you will, of how we could do this differently?
If I could wave a magic wand, victim advocates would not be mandatory reporters. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I already talked about a lot of them, and how mandatory reporting discourages folks from getting help and keeps kids in unsafe situations because their protective parent is not getting help. There is a history with our movement and child welfare, where child welfare has blamed victims, and Roshan spoke to this a little bit already, blamed victims for not leaving, for not protecting their children, for failing to protect. Children have been removed forever under this idea of failure to protect, and we blame the wrong parent. We point the finger at the victim instead of holding the offender accountable. So that has created like another layer for us, where we are bound by this obligation of mandatory reporting. We know it does harm. We know it discourages people from coming to us. Yes, or it re-victimizes the victim. And it also really creates the situation where we are probably putting the victim and the children in greater danger. As again, Roshan mentioned, we are perhaps, if CPS responds, which, one, we're getting in the situation where we're saying we have to make this report, we're mandatory reporters, we have to call, and nothing happens more often than not. And that's because of the breadth of the law. And I talked about this at our last meeting. The law is so wide, it casts such a wide net for known or suspected child abuse. If you are reporting, this came up earlier, if you have secondhand information, you didn't witness it, it's not being taken as seriously. So there are all of these things where we're like making these reports, nothing's happening, or if something does happen, then a caseworker is knocking on the abuser's door, who's going to cause more harm. So there's just so many layers of this, and so my magic wand is we just aren't mandatory reporters. We do releases of information every day, all the time, with survivors for their benefit, and that is our requirement under federal law, is that if we are going to release information, it has to be for the benefit of the survivor. We don't release information because somebody wants data. We don't release information because it might be convenient for another agency to know what's going on. We only release it when it's for the benefit of the survivor. And if, in Roshan's example of sitting with a survivor who wants to make that report, we sign a release, we make that call, we walk them through that process. We can do that, and our folks are incredibly well trained to assist folks with that process. So that would be my dream.
I appreciate that, Jennifer. And I wanted you to bring that up yourself versus me being like, I see this because all three of you mentioned that as in your own words, right? That this is the unique challenge, and that in the question of, here are the three things that the panel, that the task force said of why people make calls. every single one of you said that the number one reason you all make calls is because of liability, which is really interesting because in the education panel and a variety of other panels, it is seeking those resources, right? Because it's people that are kind of like, their sole job isn't advocacy. Their sole job is, or not their sole job, but like their main job is education, right? So they're like, this family needs help. Go get a resource. And so they're making these reports, and you all are saying, this is what we do. We are the advocate. And so like, if we have to just make a report, right, for the sake of making a report, that is creating a lot of challenges that you just named. So I just want to, you all said that, and you organically got there yourself in this conversation.
Not surprised.
That is the piece. So, and when you said that explicitly, you know, everybody's shaking their head yes there. So, so I appreciate you naming that.
I want to jump in with one other thing in response to what you just said, Trace, which is, as I said, when I introduced myself, as an agency, Project Safeguard is a member of Violence Free Colorado and CCASA. We're member programs. Those are our statewide coalitions. And so we have this built-in network across the state. We are connected. We are working together. We, like the advocates that work at my agency are connected to the advocates that work at Safe Health Denver or at other shelter programs or at mental health resources or all the housing resources. We all work together and we all know each other, and we have this community and this coalition of agencies. So the question is like, do we call CPS to connect them with resources? We don't, because we are those resources.
I appreciate you naming that. You're kind of like, it's the attitude of like, we're good. Just let us do what we do, right? And so that's kind of what I'm hearing. Doris, why don't you jump in? But I want to make sure that we get to Roshan too, to add any piece that you see that didn't get covered. Go ahead, Doris.
Yeah, I think we're good. We have the ability to provide the services and meet the needs of this survivor and family. And also we recognize the threat to the survivor and their children by making the report, right? Like, so it's like you understand the complexity of that particular set of circumstances. And if at the end of the day, the goal is to keep kids safe, not making the report actually is better at achieving that particular goal than making the report. And so I just wanted to tether it back to the why not making that report is the best cause approach, given that like the unique circumstances around domestic violence.
I think that's like, I appreciate you naming that, Doris, because like that seems to be the thread for me through all these panels is like, let's not forget that we're also people and that we will make these calls when, right. And I feel like we said that someone said that on the earlier panel. So I'm just trying to draw out that people keep saying like what you just said, Doris, that folks will say like, we're good. And we recognize like the need when there's that need, right? When we're talking about need versus liability is what I keep hearing in each of these groups. So I'm just trying to kind of connect all those pieces for me. Roshan, what else would you add? Anything as far as you I don't want to take your magic wand from you. So what did you add?
I know, right? I've been waiting for that one for years.
Yeah,
Don't take that from me now.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I have anything to add except that what I would hope happens, and I know this is a little bit beyond our purview as a task force, but when we make recommendations, I think it is vital that we acknowledge that we need more resources too. So a lot of the, I think, gaps that people are identifying, like I called the police, nobody showed up. I called CPS, nobody came. I called shelter, there was no room in the shelter. So I went back and stayed with my abuser. It's about a lack of resources. I've worked in multiple states and many counties in those states. I've never been somewhere where I was like, you know what? I've got everything I need. The only thing I need is the survivor to walk in the door. Like that has never happened to me. And it's not because I'm not a good advocate or I don't work with good advocates or, it's because we don't pay for the state, we don't pay for these things. And domestic violence is a cultural problem. It's about power. It's about racism. It's about gender. It's about sexism. But if we had safe housing for everyone, if we had fair wages for everyone, if we had childcare for everyone, it would be a lot less of a problem because people can make the choice to leave.
Most people stay because they don't have a safe way to live elsewhere. And so I I'm preaching, I hope I'm preaching to the choir a little bit here, but I guess I just want to say, like, I think part of what we're acknowledging that I'm so excited about is that putting people into the system for help is not the answer. It fails, and it especially fails particular communities. Queer survivors, trans survivors, survivors of color experience infinitely more harm in the system. But the goal of helping people, like, so what I don't want to do is withdraw the idea that it's still our responsibility to help people. And so when we say to people, hey, by the way, the system isn't right, we need to also say, you know what is? Advocacy and support. So I just would say, I know it's not our job, we can't fund everybody, but I just want to make sure that we're naming that, like, you can't withdraw this kind of, or you can't make the observations we're making in this task force without also saying that if we had the resources to send people into safety in other ways, the system could focus on many, many less things, on the most violent cases, on the most egregious situations, So I guess I just want to make sure we're thinking about, like, the other half of the conversation, which is we need to get more money and more time and more people and more resources into supporting all of the kinds of victimization that we're describing.
More money. I see Stephanie write that down on her notes. She's like, more money. Roshan, I thought you were going to finish that with, and that is why today I'm announcing my candidacy to become your next, I was waiting for the big announcement there. So maybe that comes towards the end. Well, this has been incredibly, I think, helpful. I'm seeing again the love in the chat around the unique experiences and perspectives. And what I really appreciate is that y'all are centering first and foremost the voices of the folks that you serve and work with. And that has come through loud and clear in this conversation. So thank you for that, because I think in these conversations it can be challenging, right? We're talking about your professional perspective, but you're also in every panel, you're in a space of listening and trying to bring voice to those folks. So thank you for bringing voice to your families and the kids that you serve today. Appreciate that. The thing I see from Stephanie in the chat that I do want to draw out, just Jennifer, to your point of not being victim advocates, not being mandatory reporters. Is that correct, that the data that you shared, that Colorado is only one of 9 states that have this requirement of being mandatory reporters? Or can anybody speak to that real quick, just to make sure?
Roshan, do you know the answer to that? I don't.
I think it's true, but I will double check, because we had these numbers when when the legislation was going through. I want to make sure it's 9, but definitely, I think the most important part to take home is that many, many states already have this carve out, and they haven't seen, dramatic increases in in child abuse or child death or anything. It has supported families, but I will make sure to get the number for you, because we do have it.
Yeah, I think that'll be we'll include that in the follow-up summary and minutes. We'll make sure we have that right information, but appreciate y'all bringing that. Well, I'll in the great words of the great Kathy Wells, great conversation and perspective. Thank you all. Really appreciate your vulnerability today and your willingness to share, and certainly not the last time that we will engage you on this perspective. So thank you. And I think a round of applause is due from everyone on the call. All right, I'm going to give us another break. I broke our break up into 2 chunks so that we could just kind of get our heads around ourselves after each conversation. So let's come back. I'm going to give us 8 minutes. So 10:20 sharp. We're going to start with Casey Family Programs with the data piece, and we can really dig into that. And then we'll close with some conversation. And I just want to make a note real quick. If there are members of the public on the call that want to make a public comment, please send me a note right now during the break so that we can make sure the save some time. Otherwise, we're going to bump right up against our ending call at 11. So, all right. Thanks, y'all. We'll see you back in 8 minutes exactly. Welcome back. We're going to jump in. I see my friend Steve appearing to be on the lakes of some or shores of some lake. So welcome, Steve, and Crystal Allen as well. Crystal, I just said your full name. Crystal, welcome to the call as well. All right, so I'm going to spotlight you both. We're going to dig into some data. We've got time for, again, the presentation, some questions at the end. I do have one note for public comment, so I'm going to wrap you at 10:50, just as a heads up. And we got 30 minutes for presentation and conversation, so should be good. So Steve, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to you.
Thank you very much. And I will see if I can get my screen to share. And I'm going to assume, maybe not. Can you see it, Crystal?
I can see a beautiful scene.
Yeah,
No,
we see a beautiful scene.
We're looking at your desktop.
Let's try
The
again.
desktop needs a little cleanup.
Yeah.
It looks
Other
way
than that,
better
we're
this
okay.
time.
Let's see. Let's try this again.
We
There we
see
go.
that,
All right.
but
There we go.
it's not a full screen.
Not yet. Okay. Thank you.
There you go.
Looking better. Thanks, Crystal. So we are going to go through the data set that many of you have probably seen portions of it already. If you've been a part of the last couple of months worth of data, I'm using the same format as we kind of go through, but this time the focus is going to be on the reporting sources of the legal and law enforcement category. And we'll kind of spend a little additional time on that piece of it. And as I go through this, Crystal will interrupt at any point and slow me down or want to spend a little bit of time on a particular slide. So I invite her to do that, as well as anybody else. I cannot see chat, so Crystal will let me know if there's a chat piece I need to stop and talk about, get some clarity around. But other than that, I think we'll go ahead and get started, unless Crystal, you have something you want to say?
Nope, go right ahead.
All right. First, I think I just, especially for today's discussion, I really appreciate the first two sets of panels that are happening, because I think well, there's two ways to approach the data in terms of where to put it in the agenda. And a lot of folks like to put it at the beginning, start it out, say, here's the data, then we can go into either panels or discussion. And what's been happening through these last few minutes is meetings is having the panels go first, which I think for this particular purpose, it's helpful. And I think it kind of really starts highlighting people's thoughts and around different particular panels. So when the data comes up, they're primed to kind of start thinking about what did I hear and how may that be playing into what I am seeing now in the data, which then kind of hopefully sparks the next question: what can we do to change the data if we want to change the data? So I think that's really nicely done from all of you. So I got to move that down a little bit. Sorry. Okay. Just some house cleaning and terminology, because sometimes I will throw out terminology people aren't used to. The data sources that we are looking at when we go to get to the actual data come from both the AFCARS, which is the Adoption and Foster Care Analysis Reporting System. And that data set comes from the state, and it includes all the children that enter foster care and are in foster care for a particular federal fiscal year period of time. It gives also the demographic informations and a bunch of other bits and pieces. The other major data set that we use is the NCANS data set, the National Child Abuse and Neglect Data System. Same idea, but the population that goes into the NCANS are all children that come to the attention of the state agency and are accepted for an investigation, and then all the details behind that investigation. It is not all kids that are called to the hotline, and because a good proportion of kids called to the hotline are screened out. They never have an investigation that happens. So we don't have information on that population, only on the ones that are accepted for the investigation. And my next data point down there kind of even emphasizes that even more. So in Colorado, they report about 2 out of every 3 reports are screened out. So we're only seeing 1 out of 3 kids. So there's a huge other population that are looking for potential services or are coming to the attention because someone suspects abuse, but just doesn't meet that requirement. Race and multiracial. Pretty much every data slide we look at as we go through here will include the data disaggregated by race and ethnicity. I have limited the race and ethnic groups that we show on this slide to only those that have at least 50 kids in care, primarily because when you start reducing the number of kids, the races that have very small number of kids in care, you start seeing very large fluctuation in the data. So you'll have something go from 0% to 100% to 50% to 100%, and it's distracting. And that's mainly because the denominators are so small. It just takes one extra kid to really jump those numbers around. So it kind of flattens out the data a little bit. But that does not mean, because I've limited it, that all race and ethnicities are not important. It's just a way to make the data more visual and more meaningful in reading it. Also keep in mind that on the graphs, because there are at least 50 kids of multiracial, so 2 or more races identified. And in Colorado, about 80% of those kids identified as multiracial are coded as Black and white. So when you see those multiracial line on the graph, you can, in your mind, you can just take that population of kids and, if you choose to, and kind of place them into the Black category to look for even additional and more pronounced disproportionality amongst different races. Or you can look at multiracial Black, white as just its own category as it is.
Hey, Steve,
And
I've got a
finally,
question in the chat asking if Colorado is still using, well, I tell you what, Donna Wilson, why don't you ask this question? Because I'm a little bit confused with the
Sure.
word.
Yeah. If you're not a data person, it's a little confusing. But so back in the day when we used to collect data, Steve, trails would we use census data, and so census data historically uses the Hispanic trump. So what that means is if you're white and Hispanic, you're Hispanic. If you're Black and Hispanic, you're Hispanic. You know what I mean? So so Hispanic sort of trumped everything. What that causes is some inaccuracies in our system, right? So if you're Native and Hispanic, you're now been wiped away, just like other races, because of that Hispanic trump. So in order to get a real view of the data, you would have to flip that trump in order to really see like the Native population in a community, for instance. Do you know what Colorado is doing currently? Because this is back in the day when I ran the Colorado Disparities Resource Center, and that's the way we did it because it matched what the census did. But you know, the census has modified some stuff now, so I'm just curious where we are today.
yeah, so I'll give you maybe an oversimplified answer to that. And if there's anybody from the state that want to go deeper into it, and we can do so here, or we can wait till the end. But how the race is reported in APGARs and NCANs is through a series of fields called is, like is white, is Black, is American Indian. And so depending on how many choices that social worker clicked, those will all become the category as a one yes, no field. So yes, that child was marked as Hispanic, and yes, is marked as Native American in your one example. So from there, we have to create derived fields in order to report out how is this child going to look. And Casey, what Casey does in order to, similar to match to the census, because if you want to do a rate per 1,000, you'd have to have a matching to the census. We do, if a child is marked Hispanic in any other category, that child will become Hispanic in this data set we're looking at. If its child is, then it goes, looks at a primary race alone. So if it's only marked American Indian, that child will be American Indian. If it's American Indian and something else, it's going to multiracial. So to your point, where I think you're going to get at is that that Native American population, but probably in Colorado, so there's probably a bigger population of Native Americans than we're going to see here, is being kind of diluted out into both the Hispanic as well as into the multiracial categories. So yes. So, but this is kind of we're consistent on it. So it's not a best case scenario, but we're being consistent over time so we can at least see how things look. At any point, we can redo these slides if it becomes important at some point and just look at the is Native American category. So who, regardless if they have any other categories, we can just look at that.
Which is what we had to do, Steve, just so you know, to make sure that we were accurately counting our American, Native American population in our state and get an accurate data count. The only other question that I had really quick, and then I'll let you go through your slides, is I saw that you mentioned it's best to have families respond and to provide that data information. Do we have any sense whether or not folks are actually asking, because that was a big problem when we had that field mandatory, made mandatory in trails, is that folks still were not asking the question. So respectful inquiry and teaching and training folks on how to ask the question became a big deal. Versus, folks were doing things like, well, they look like they are, and then they would fill it in, or they would assume the child would be the same race as the mother, and they would just enter the mother's race, which again, if you're multiracial, that doesn't really work well. So just curious if we know from a practice standpoint, not in theory, but in practice, what's happening in real time.
So I just want to offer that I know that the Colorado Department of Human Services Division of Child Welfare has been working with the counties to address some of that. And this is true nationwide, is we have a lot to learn about how to allow families and individuals to self-identify versus choosing what you think they are, what they look like, assuming the whole family's the same. And it's a complexity that's not easy to really do a great job on, but I do think that there is some work on that ongoing with in Colorado. And you might want to look in the chat too. Yolanda from the Division of Child Welfare of Colorado mentioned, reminded us all that race is one thing and ethnicity, Hispanic ethnicity, is another thing. So, and I see somebody asked about LGBTQ data, and I am not sure that we collect that data in the trail system. So if anyone knows, please let me know. I know that it's not required on the federal level. And there are other questions about Middle Eastern, North African. I mean, there are a lot of challenges with getting the right data in, and choices are limited in trails, I know. So sorry, Steve, take it away.
No, that's fine. And I'm just putting
LGBTQ is not collected in trails, just like in other states.
Yeah, so tends to be a state by state, whether their system collects that information or not, but it definitely does not go to APCARs and NCANs as of yet. And I know there are a number of states that are kind of pushing to try to get this in the future changes of APCARs and NCANs, but for the near future, it won't be available. So Casey will not be able to report off of it. So, okay, I will continue on, and Crystal will let me know if anything else pops up that we should stop and discuss. So thank you. The last piece on this slide is we also, I think last session, started looking at the data disaggregated by urban counties and rural counties. So what you see below there are the list of the urban counties that went into that category. All the other counties fell into the rural counties. Okay, so let's start looking at the data. A good starting point that we often use at Casey is kind of looking at the system at major decision points or major points in time that the child may experience the whole system, and look to see whether or not there's some equity in that system compared to a general population. So if you think about it, if you have a general population of Colorado and of kids of under 18, and you have a racial breakdown of those kids. And so you can see that about 34% of the kids in Colorado are coded as Latinx, about 5% are Black African American, and 52% are white. So if you have a system that is equitable or more equitable, it's wrong choices of words, but it's what I'm going to use for now, you would kind of expect at each decision point about the same proportion to be experiencing that point. So for screening in, if you had 5% of kids in the general population, you would think about 5% would screen in for an investigation, and 5% would substantiate, and 5% would enter. You'd see that thickness of the bar being consistent going across time. And in Colorado, predominantly you have overrepresentation of the Black African American population. So we have that 5% are in the general population, but at least double at every decision point are Black African American kids. So 10% at the screening in, all the way to about triple the amount of you'd expect at kids aging out at 15%. Kinship is kind of the flip side of it. You'd actually want overrepresentation in kinship care because you would hope that their kids are placed in kin. So there's actually not quite as much, but it is overrepresented, which is a good thing. All the rest you would not want necessarily see overrepresentation happening. So since we're focused on that screening and who's calling in, we'll start with just the general screening of kids into the for an investigation or assessment. The orange line you see in the far left is that about 33 kids per 1,000 kids in the general population, or 33 out of 1,000, will screen in for an investigation. It's slightly lower than the national rate, about 40. So Colorado doesn't screen in quite as many as nationally. If you break that down by urban and rural, the middle graph, you see similar numbers, 33 and 36, a difference of 3. You can see the urban, as you would expect, is much closer to the Colorado average because that's where the vast majority of the kids are. So that's going to kind of weigh and be heavier. That's why you don't see quite as much split there. But when you start looking at the difference within by race, you start seeing those that disproportionality really start kind of showing itself. And you can see that Black African-American kids over the last, since 2015, has pretty consistently been increasing calling in. So they started back in 2015 of screening in about 54 per 1,000, and now they're up to 74, where the other race and ethnicities have tended to be relatively flat over time. So these little bit of jumping you see kind of going on in this earlier years is being driven by Black African-American kids screening in for investigations. So who's calling in those reports? So we just saw that about 33 out of 1,000 are being screened in, but of those reports being called in and accepted for investigation, who are the top 3 reporter sources? In the last 2 sessions, we've talked about the educators in childcare and the medical mental health. And today we're kind of focused on the legal and law enforcement, the top graph. And they call in about 30%. So almost a third, almost 1 out of 3 kids that screen in for investigation are called in from the legal law enforcement court type personnel. And they've been the highest over time. There was some decreasing you saw in the first sets of years, and then the last 3 years or so, there've been slight increasing on that proportion. When you break that data down by the rural and the urban, not a lot of difference, 31 to 29%, not pretty consistent. That upward climb you see from 28 to 30 is being driven by the urban, but we kind of expect that. We touched on that a little bit, that's where most of the calls are coming from. But how about if you look at it by race and ethnicity of those, and this is race ethnicity of those called in by the law enforcement. You can see that starting in about 2018, the Black African-American population has been increasing while the other ones have been relatively flat. So this kind of indicates to me that this increase of proportions by law enforcement is being driven by this Black African-American population. So the other groups of calls have been stable. Black African-American calls are being accepted over time by law enforcement higher and higher as the last few years have been going on. Slightly with Latinx, but mostly with the Black African-American.
Steve, we have a question. Is there any way to separate out the law enforcement versus the legal community, given that there's some mandated requirements around cross-reporting to law enforcement?
Yeah, no, that's the short. Unfortunately, this is one of those fields that I didn't group myself that NCANS calls it legal/law enforcement. And I looked at the mapping for Colorado, and Colorado looks like there's 2 groups, court personnel and law enforcement. Those are looks like the 2 groups that go into this counting. I'm not sure because we had advocates on the call. I don't know where advocates fall into. We'd have to ask Colorado directly, but I'm thinking they fall into maybe social service personnel, which we haven't talked about, but I can't say for sure.
Thank you.
Okay, so now we're looking at just, again, generally, not calls just by law enforcement, legal grouping, but generally all those calls that are coming in and been accepted. What is the finding from that? What's the disposition? And we can see about 80% of all the calls, and that's the red line and the gold line, or I'm sorry, the green line and the gold line are not substantiated. So you have 50% that are unsubstantiated, and you've been seeing this trend upwards of alternative response, that's AR, been increasing about 30%. So that leaves about 27% that are being substantiated. And that has been pretty stable over time. You've been seeing the decrease in unsubstantiated, increases of alternative response. We've talked about this before, that it feels as though that's being driven because alternative response is slowly rolling out statewide. And so because as it slowly rolls out, we start seeing more and more of those reports go into alternative response. And it's affecting mostly the unsubstantiated. It's not really affecting the substantiations at all. So. And if you break that down by urban and rural, you'll see that the same type of trends pretty consistently for the substantiations, the increasing of alternative response, decreasing by the unsubstantiated. You see that increase and decrease most significantly in the rural. And my understanding is that some of the urban counties haven't started implementing alternative response yet. So you're, because you don't have the bigger counties doing it, you're going to see most of the impact on this rural section. If you break that down by race ethnicity in here, you can look at the substantiations and then kind of slowly increasing at a slow unsubstantiation and pretty flat alternative response on here. But one of the things we pointed out on prior slides, what seems to be mostly kind of impacting this increasing alternative response is the white population. So you're seeing more of an increased alternative response. I'm going to flip back to black. Then you're seeing that increase on the other races in here. So more, and that may be tied to urban and rural. It's kind of hard to say without really kind of getting down into the data, but definitely more white folks are kind of going down that alternative response, white children, than other children. Okay, so I'll orientate those that have not seen this type of slide. The far left graph, far left column you see down here is of all the calls that came in and were screened in for an investigation, what percent were called in by each of these groups of people? So you can see 30% were called in by legal law enforcement and 18 were called in by family and friends. The right-hand column is what was the finding of those reports? Was it substantiated, unsubstantiated, that nature? And the middle of all those little pretty lines going everywhere, that's kind of takes all those calls that are called in and it splits them out into where the finding was. So you can look to see what proportion of things, of the calls by a specific group went to what type of finding. So law enforcement, which is today's kind of focus, just visually looking at it, you can see a relatively equal distribution of reports going to each of the 3 buckets of findings. You have about 42% that are substantiated, and you have about 34 that are unsubstantiated. And this bucket is a little more unique than the other groups in terms of the proportions about being the same. If you educator, childcare, remember, you have the very few go to substantiated, and we talked about medical, mental health. You have a larger proportion go to unsubstantiated. So legal law enforcement is relatively equal on that piece. If you just look at those, excuse me, substantiated, sorry about that. You can see of those that are just substantiated, the biggest proportion, all of those are coming from the legal law enforcement. So legal law enforcement is calling in the most, and the department is substantiating those reports the most of all of the other groups that we're seeing. So now we're going to narrow the focus down to just looking at the reports coming in by legal and law enforcement professionals. So not the full universe of those being screened in, but just those screened in by the legal and law enforcement. So this data we've kind of seen in a prior one, just all put into one page. We saw that about 30% were being screened in. We saw about a similar distribution by locality. And we saw the Black African-American children are showing the most pronounced increases compared to the other races. So now we're going to look at those by disposition, the findings. So again, of all, just the law enforcement personnel groupings. We can see that of the law enforcement ones, there's been a slow, little less steep increase in alternative response and decrease in unsubstantiated. If you remember the prior slides, that slope, how steep that line is, was a little bit higher in both the alternative response and a little bit downwards more on the unsubstantiated. Substantiated is relatively high, it's 42%. If I remember correctly on the earlier slide, we saw that there's 27% overall are substantiated. Law enforcement's 42% are substantiated. So if you look by locality on here, the rural, it's kind of that same trend. You're seeing increase of alternate response, decrease of unsubstantiated. And these are almost reciprocal. They're almost exactly the same kind of angle on both of them. And you see that relatively flat substantiation piece of it. With Black African-American children, relatively flat across the board. There's not really any significant changes over time with the Black African-American population. But we can also look at the law enforcement reports that are coming in on what type of reports are they calling in. So are they calling in, I'm going to, even though it says neglect, I'm going to start with like emotional neglect. You can see that of those kids that came in that had emotional neglect, they call in about 14% of them. And I'll just kind of focus on the law enforcement. So a little bit smaller proportion that are coming in from emotional neglect. Your medical neglect, they don't call in very many medical neglect at all. So sexual abuse, they're reporting about 24% of them, and the vast majority are going to either unsubstantiated or substantiated, which we'd expect. We wouldn't expect sexual abuse allegations to go into alternative response. And our physical abuse, they're calling it about 17% of them. But by far, the biggest proportion that they call in are the neglect allegations. And if you can see, they kind of muted over here. The next closest is medical mental health, which is 24%. And then you have educators, about 18%. So they call in the neglect at higher rates than the other groupings and lower rates from the other mandated reporters that we saw. And of the neglect allegations themselves, they tend to be a little bit more substantiated, 44% on here. If you remember that prior graph, these three bars are a little bit more equal in terms of width of it, so that proportion. But when you're looking just in neglect, a little bit larger proportion are going to substantiated. Not alternative response or not unsubstantiated, but they're going to substantiating those neglect allegations. And so we dig it down even another layer on here. So these are, again, the calls coming in from law enforcement personnel and have allegations of neglect. So there's two different layers deeper. You see about that 32% are being called in. It's been increasing the last couple of years over time from 30% in 2018 to 32 currently. So slowly increasing that. About the same in terms of the urban and rural. The rural has a little bit higher, a little bit steeper, that's the way I think of it, increase in terms of those calls. So it might be driving a little bit of this increase, those rural neglect calls. And the disposition is a little more flat. Some of the other slides we saw, we're seeing the alternative response and the unsubstantiated almost crossing each other. Here, they're staying a little bit relatively flat, and you're seeing our substantiations were actually increasing for a number of years. Last 2 years, they've dropped a little bit, but they got as high as 49%, almost half of the calls called in by law enforcement within the general neglect were being substantiated. That included general neglect. I need to make sure that's clear because it could be multiple reasons. It could be general neglect and something else, but it includes general neglect. And if you look at the dispositions by locality, you're seeing kind of that crisscross on the urban, a little bit more flat on the, I'm sorry, crisscross on the rural, a little bit flatter on the urban. Those sex abuse ones, if you remember, they're a little bit smaller, a little lower. If you remember that prior pretty graph that had all the different colors on it, you've been seeing less sexual abuse allegations being called in over time. Little anomaly in 2021. So who knows what will happen in 2022, might drop back down. But the trend has been downwards, relatively flat in urban. It's a bit in rural, been driven by urban. And you don't expect alternative response really to have sexual abuse allegations. So you're seeing our relatively flat substantiations and unsubstantiations.
So Steve, I know we're just about out of time. If you have anything really significant to share.
Nope, thank you, Crystal. No, so basically the trends we see in both physical abuse, I'll leave it up for 1 second, but I'll talk about it. Been increasing on physical abuse over time. And that was the last one anyway, so, yep. Thanks, Crystal.
Wow, Steve, that you wrapped up better than anybody I know. You're like, appreciate that. I wish we had time for questions. I see some really powerful kind of notes and comments in the chat. So we'll check those, Steve and Crystal, as well. And what we'll do is we'll follow up in the minutes and notes with any responses there. That will be helpful for the group. So we'll be sure to capture all of those. And we have a few minutes left and we have public comments. So if folks do have questions still kind of lingering for Steve and Crystal, just drop them in the chat. If they're able to answer now, we will. And if not, we'll follow up kind of through the email chain. All right. So with that, appreciate y'all. I am going to move us into public comment. We have one public comment that I just want to make sure we are able to get to. So Sarah Perkins, if you can come off mute, introduce yourself just so that we can make note of that, and would love to hear from you. So you have about 3 to 4 minutes.
Thank you so much. Hi, I'm Sarah Perkins. I'm a parent with lived experience of mandatory reporters and CPS removals. Our kids were taken about a year ago. It was national news in several, like about a dozen or 2 dozen different news sources, including Front Page on the Washington Post and Fox National. And because of that, we've had, more than 100 families reach out to us who are currently experiencing struggles with mandatory reporters and CPS. And so I just wanted to, when we're talking about mandatory reports, I just wanted to underscore the sort of system that we're sending parents to when we report them to CPS. And I just think it's useful to remember just how destructive and coercive a system CPS is. It's a system that functions by taking kids and using the threat of taking kids to coerce behaviors from parents. And the services they offer are not helpful and usually re-traumatizing, either parenting classes or very aggressive supervised visits. So I think, I'm so glad to see that we're talking about exempting certain professions from mandatory reporting. But as long as we're having conversations about this, I think, entirely eliminating mandatory reporting needs to be on the table. We have to, when we're deciding who goes into this system, it has to be determined by something other than personal liability. That has to be the ethical stance. Particularly because there's so little research that shows that making more people mandatory reporting actually decreases children's death by neglect or abuse or maltreatment. And there's a lot of evidence, or there's good reason, I think, to believe that bringing humanity to the room rather than liability, of having informed, rare, uncoerced reporting of kids who are at imminent risk of danger of injury or death actually works as well to keep kids safe. And so again, I'm glad to see that we're having conversations about exempting certain professions and populations. But I think there's really good reasons and arguments for entirely eliminating mandatory reporting in favor of informed, rare, voluntary reporting. And for parents and families who aren't reported, they should receive, but who need help and supports, I think we need to be able to provide them with services through departments and organizations that are entirely removed from CPS. against there's not the threat of reports or of being thrown into a system that's going to use their kids as a carrot to coerce behavior. That's all.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks for being here. Appreciate you providing your perspective and experience and join us for the call today. I think you joined the whole call, so appreciate you being here and participating as a member of the public. With that said, I am going to, we'll make sure, and also just Sarah, I'm not sure if you've joined previous meetings, but just so you know, those will be captured. Those comments are captured in our meeting minutes and summaries for the task force as they consider moving forward with any consideration of recommendations, et cetera. So we don't have time in the meetings to respond directly to public comment with the way it's set up, but we do capture it that way and bring that back to the task force as they continue their work. So just want to make sure that's clear to you. So appreciate you being here. All right, so with that said, we've got 2 minutes left. I hate when people say they're giving you time back. I'm not giving you any time back. I know that it's just the 58th, so appreciate y'all being here today. Really rich discussions, and just really appreciate folks bringing their perspectives, their vulnerabilities, and your expertise, that you're making up this, you're doing this work with us. So thank you. We will, we saw you just a couple weeks ago, so this felt really quick to turn around and do this meeting. And now we're going to have quite a bit of a gap going into September. So just want to note that for you all. We got a lot of work to do on our end to start synthesizing. We're stopping right now. This is the end of the panels of folks that make the calls, and we're going to be pivoting in September of folks that receive the calls and then going from there. So just a reminder. So again, deep appreciation for folks that are on the panel, that have been on all the panels, and we will see you in late September, which is crazy, and we'll be emailing and doing some work digitally before then. So stick around with any questions. Otherwise, appreciate y'all's time, and we'll see you soon. Take care.